Picture a cold, brilliant morning in Washington on January 20th, 1961, where a young president stands before the nation delivering words that will echo through history, asking Americans not what their country can do for them, but what they can do for their country. And as the crowd erupts in thunderous applause, something remarkable is happening in the silence of who isn't there. Because among the former presidents who traditionally gather on that platform, one man is conspicuously absent: Harry Truman, the plain-speaking farmer's son from Missouri who left the White House just 8 years earlier. Still healthy and active at 76, isn't standing with the others. And it's not because he forgot the date or had a scheduling conflict. It's because he wasn't invited, and even if an invitation had arrived at his doorstep in Independence, Missouri, he wouldn't have attended anyway. Because these two men, the old Democratic president and the new one, genuinely hated each other with a passion that ran deeper than politics, deeper than policy, straight down into the raw nerves of pride and class and generational warfare. This is the story of how John F. Kennedy, the golden boy of American politics, banned Harry Truman, the only living Democratic ex-president, from the White House for 2 full years. A petty act of political revenge that revealed the ugly truth about how much personal hatred can poison even the highest levels of American democracy. And to understand why Kennedy would do something so vindictive, we need to go back to the summer of 1960, when the battle for the Democratic nomination was reaching its climax and Truman decided to destroy Kennedy's presidential dreams. Kennedy was the frontrunner that summer, young and handsome and wealthy beyond imagination, with a war hero story that captivated the public and a sophisticated political machine funded by his father's seemingly endless fortune. And Harry Truman absolutely couldn't stand him, not just disagreed with him or preferred another candidate, but genuinely despised everything Kennedy represented. In July 1960, just days before the Democratic convention was set to begin, Truman called a press conference that stunned the political world, announcing he wouldn't attend the convention because it was rigged for Kennedy. Controlled by his father Joe Kennedy, who had spent a fortune buying the nomination for his privileged son. And then Truman went further, questioning whether this 43-year-old senator with his fancy Harvard education and his glamorous wife was actually mature enough, experienced enough, ready enough to be president of the United States. "Senator, are you certain you are quite ready for the country, or that the country is ready for you?" Truman asked, and those words landed like a bomb because they weren't coming from some partisan Republican or jealous rival. They were coming from Harry Truman, the man who had made the decision to drop atomic bombs on Japan, who had stared down the Soviet Union, who had fired the legendary General Douglas MacArthur, who had earned his credibility through the hardest decisions any president could make. And now he was using all that credibility to call Kennedy an unqualified rich kid whose main achievement was being born into the right family. The attack was devastating, and it was personal, and it was meant to be both, because Truman had several reasons for wanting to stop Kennedy, starting with his genuine belief that Kennedy simply wasn't ready for the job, having served less than 8 years in the Senate without ever governing anything, never making the tough executive decisions that come with running a state or managing a large organization. His main qualifications being that he looked good on television, spoke well, and had access to his father's money. But Truman's hatred went deeper than concerns about experience, because Truman absolutely despised Joe Kennedy, the father who was orchestrating his son's rise to power, remembering how Joe had served as ambassador to Britain in the late 1930s and advocated for appeasing Hitler, saying Britain couldn't win against Germany and America should stay out of European affairs, which to Truman, who had fought in the trenches of World War I and understood the existential threat of fascism, made Joe Kennedy either a coward or a Nazi sympathizer, or possibly both. Joe Kennedy had also made his fortune through questionable means, with persistent rumors about bootlegging during Prohibition, using that money to buy political influence and power, and Truman, who had clawed his way up from poverty through hard work and political skill, resented wealthy men who thought they could simply purchase the presidency like another piece of real estate. Beyond his hatred of Joe Kennedy, Truman was supporting Lyndon Johnson for president, believing that Johnson, with his years as Senate Majority Leader and his genuine legislative accomplishments and his deep understanding of how government actually worked, was obviously more qualified than this young senator who seemed more concerned with his public image than with policy substance. And Truman was frustrated that Kennedy's money and charm and good looks were winning over experience and competence. There was also the Catholic issue hanging over everything, because Kennedy would be the first Catholic president if elected, and while Truman wasn't personally anti-Catholic, he worried that Kennedy's religion would cost Democrats the election, making his nomination a reckless gamble with control of the White House at a time when Democrats couldn't afford to lose. Kennedy's response to Truman's attack was absolutely masterful, a political counterpunch that turned Truman's criticism into an asset, because instead of getting defensive or angry, Kennedy calmly held his own press conference and announced he had sent Truman a telegram with a series of pointed questions, asking whether Truman thought 43 was too young for a president when Truman himself had appointed Kennedy to an international position in 1945 when Kennedy was only 28, reminding everyone that Kennedy had served in Congress for 14 years. The exact same period Truman had served before becoming president. This was brilliant political judo, using Truman's own history against him, because Truman himself had been considered inexperienced when he suddenly became president after Roosevelt's death, a senator for 10 years before becoming vice president, roughly the same resume as Kennedy. So if Truman was qualified at 60, why wasn't Kennedy qualified at 43? Kennedy also pointed out that Truman was supporting his Senate colleague Johnson, which made the whole thing look like insider politics rather than principled objection to inexperience, positioning himself as the outsider fighting against the party establishment with Truman as part of that establishment trying to block him. And the public absolutely loved Kennedy's response, while Truman suddenly looked like a bitter old man trying to protect his cronies from a new generation of leadership. Truman's attack had completely backfired, actually strengthening Kennedy's narrative as a young fighter taking on the party bosses. And Kennedy went on to win the nomination at the convention in Los Angeles, with Truman eventually endorsing him for the general election, but only because Kennedy was running against Richard Nixon, whom Truman hated even more than Kennedy, making his endorsement grudging and unenthusiastic, making it clear he was supporting the Democratic Party and not the man who would lead it. Kennedy won the presidency in November 1960 in one of the closest elections in American history, defeating Nixon by the thinnest of margins. And throughout the campaign and after his victory, Kennedy never forgot and never forgave Truman's attempt to destroy his candidacy. And when Inauguration Day arrived on that cold January morning, Truman wasn't there, deliberately excluded, and that exclusion was just the beginning of Kennedy's revenge. Traditionally, former presidents are honored guests at the White House, invited to state dinners and ceremonial occasions and important policy announcements as a way of showing respect for the office and maintaining continuity across administrations. And Kennedy did invite Herbert Hoover, the elderly Republican ex-president who was apolitical by that point in his life. But Harry Truman, the only living Democratic ex-president, the man from Kennedy's own party who should have been his honored predecessor, received nothing, no invitations to state dinners, no ceremonial events, no policy announcements, frozen out completely 4 full years as if he didn't exist. This wasn't an oversight or a bureaucratic mistake. This was deliberate and petty and vindictive, because the Kennedy White House was famous for its glamorous events, hosting intellectuals and artists and celebrities, making the White House the center of American cultural life. And they made absolutely certain that Harry Truman knew he wasn't part of any of it. And Kennedy was vindictive because Truman had tried to humiliate him at the worst possible moment, questioning his qualifications and calling him an unqualified rich kid just as Kennedy was reaching for his life's ambition. Kennedy knew that Truman's attack had hurt him. That polling showed significant numbers of Democrats questioning his experience after Truman's press conference. And even though Kennedy won anyway, Truman had wounded him at a crucial moment. And Kennedy believed in getting even, in making sure people understood that challenging him came with consequences. There was also a profound class dimension to their mutual hatred that went beyond politics into the realm of culture and identity. Because Kennedy came from one of America's wealthiest families, attended Harvard, moved effortlessly through elite social circles, married Jacqueline Bouvier, who was cultivated and sophisticated and fluent in French and educated at the Sorbonne, representing American aristocracy at its peak, while Truman was decidedly not aristocratic, having grown up on a farm in Missouri, never graduating from college, failing in business before entering politics through a corrupt Kansas City machine. Married to Bess, who was solid and unpretentious and completely uninterested in Washington society, representing ordinary middle America. Kennedy looked down on Truman as provincial and unsophisticated, a relic of a cruder era, while Truman resented Kennedy as spoiled and entitled, someone who had never struggled for anything, never understood what real work meant, never earned his position through merit. And each man embodied what the other despised about American society, creating a chasm between them that no amount of shared party affiliation could bridge. The freeze continued through 1961 and into 1962, with Truman reading in newspapers about White House events he wasn't invited to, seeing photos of Kennedy with other former officials and knowing he was being deliberately excluded, humiliating for a man who had been president, who had made decisions that literally shaped the world, who had authorized atomic weapons and faced down the Soviet Union and rebuilt Europe and fought a war in Korea. And Truman didn't suffer this humiliation silently. He gave interviews criticizing Kennedy's policies, questioning Kennedy's handling of the Bay of Pigs invasion in April 1961 and suggesting that a more experienced president wouldn't have approved such a poorly planned operation, criticizing Kennedy's approach to civil rights as too cautious, suggesting that Kennedy was more concerned with style than substance, with looking good than doing good, and these criticisms stung because they had truth to them. The Bay of Pigs had been a complete disaster. Kennedy's civil rights record in his first 2 years was indeed cautious to the point of timidity, and there was substance to the charge that Kennedy focused more on image and public relations than on the difficult work of policy implementation. But Truman's criticisms also looked like sour grapes from a bitter old man who couldn't accept that his era was over, that a new generation had taken command, and Kennedy's people made sure to frame it exactly that way, leaking stories about Truman being jealous of Kennedy's popularity and glamour, suggesting Truman was desperately trying to stay relevant in a political world that had moved past him. Even the Cuban Missile Crisis in October 1962, when Kennedy successfully navigated the world away from nuclear war and earned praise from critics across the political spectrum, changed nothing in their relationship because while Truman gave grudging acknowledgement that Kennedy had handled the crisis well, he also noted that Kennedy's botched Bay of Pigs invasion had created the conditions for the crisis in the first place. And still no White House invitation arrived in Independence, Missouri. By late 1962, the ban on Truman was becoming genuinely embarrassing for Kennedy, with the press noting that Truman hadn't been to the Kennedy White House even once. Democratic senators asking why their president was freezing out the party's elder statesmen, and even some of Kennedy's own advisors suggesting it was time to make peace. But Kennedy resisted because he didn't want to give Truman the satisfaction, didn't want photos of himself with Truman that would suggest he needed the old man's blessing or approval, wanted it to be absolutely clear that he had won the presidency despite Truman's opposition, not because of anything Truman had done. But political pressure mounted as Kennedy looked ahead to re-election in 1964 and realized he needed party unity, that having a public feud with the only living Democratic ex-president was a political liability he couldn't afford. So, in early 1963, Kennedy's staff reached out to Truman about visiting the White House. Not for anything major, just a courtesy call. A brief meeting to show there were no hard feelings. A photo opportunity and a handshake and everyone moves on. But Truman initially refused because he wasn't going to be summoned to the White House like some supplicant after being ignored for 2 years, telling Kennedy's people that if the president wanted reconciliation, he could come to Independence and visit Truman on his home ground. This created a standoff between two impossibly proud men, with Kennedy refusing to travel to Missouri to kiss Truman's ring and Truman refusing to go to Washington to be patronized by a president who had frozen him out, until mutual friends in the Democratic Party negotiated a compromise, where Kennedy would publicly praise Truman's presidency and acknowledge his contributions while Truman would accept an invitation to a White House event celebrating Medicare, which both men supported, allowing reconciliation without either man appearing to capitulate. The event happened in the spring of 1963, with Truman coming to the White House for the first time in Kennedy's presidency, and the photos from that day show to men who clearly don't like each other making the best of an awkward situation. Kennedy smiling his public smile that's charming but not warm. Truman looking stiff and uncomfortable like he'd rather be literally anywhere else. And they shook hands for the cameras while Kennedy said some nice things about Truman's legacy and Truman nodded politely before leaving as quickly as he could. The official reconciliation having occurred while the genuine hatred remained completely intact. Kennedy finally relented because keeping Truman banned was hurting Kennedy more than it was hurting Truman, making Kennedy look petty and vindictive, suggesting weakness that he was so threatened by an old man's criticism that he had to exclude him, creating unnecessary conflict within the Democratic Party at a time when unity was essential. And Kennedy was also thinking about history, about how he wanted to be remembered, expecting to serve 8 years and wanting to be seen as a great president rather than someone who conducted petty feuds with his predecessors. So reconciling with Truman, even superficially, served Kennedy's long-term interests. But the reconciliation was purely cosmetic, a performance for the cameras and nothing more. Because Kennedy and Truman never developed a real relationship after that, never sought each other's counsel, and when Kennedy faced difficult decisions, he didn't call Truman for advice. And when Truman had opinions about policy, Kennedy didn't want to hear them. The class and generational divide simply too deep to bridge. Representing fundamentally different versions of what the Democratic Party should be, Kennedy represented a new Democratic Party that was urban and educated and sophisticated, focused on civil rights and international affairs and cultural progress, while Truman represented the old Democratic Party that was working class and practical, focused on economic security and containing communism and maintaining traditional values. And these were genuinely different parties with different worldviews. And Kennedy was making clear through his treatment of Truman that the old version was obsolete, that Truman's era was finished, that a new generation had taken command. The tragic irony is that many of Kennedy's worst problems in office were exactly the kinds of things Truman had faced and could have advised on. Because the Bay of Pigs disaster came from trusting intelligence agencies without questioning their assumptions. Something Truman had learned the hard way when dealing with the CIA. And Kennedy's difficulties with Congress came from having grand visions without the legislative experience to implement them, which Truman understood deeply, and the challenges of managing a diverse party coalition were Truman's absolute specialty. But Kennedy never asked for help and Truman never offered it. Their mutual hatred preventing what could have been a valuable mentoring relationship. And Kennedy's presidency suffered for their pride. When Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas in November 1963, Truman was devastated, not because he had liked Kennedy personally, but because he respected the office of the presidency and understood the tragedy for the nation. Attending Kennedy's funeral and being gracious to the Kennedy family, because whatever his feelings about John Kennedy the man, Truman believed that presidents deserved respect. After Kennedy's death, Truman was more generous about his presidency, acknowledging Kennedy's accomplishments on civil rights and foreign policy. But Truman also continued to insist that Kennedy had been inexperienced and that his youth had been a genuine liability. So even in death, Kennedy couldn't earn Truman's full approval, and the Kennedy family never forgave Truman for his 1960 attacks, with Robert Kennedy making clear when he ran for president in 1968 that Truman's support wasn't welcome, because the Kennedys remembered who their enemies were and they never forgot. Looking back at this bitter feud reveals important truths about American politics that remain relevant today, showing how intensely personal these conflicts are. How much ego and pride drive the people we elect to lead us. Because Kennedy banned Truman from the White House not because of policy differences or political strategy, but purely because Truman had wounded his pride by questioning his qualifications. And that's a level of pettiness that should concern anyone who cares about effective government. The feud also reveals the generational conflict within the Democratic Party that was tearing it apart, with Truman representing New Deal Democrats who were working class and economically focused and socially conservative, while Kennedy represented a newer coalition of educated professionals who were socially liberal and internationally engaged. And these groups didn't understand each other, didn't respect each other, couldn't find common ground even when they theoretically shared the same party, and that conflict continues today in different forms. The class dimension of their hatred was equally real and equally important, with Truman's resentment of Kennedy's wealth and privilege running deep into his sense of fairness and justice, while Kennedy's dismissal of Truman as unsophisticated revealed the elite contempt for ordinary Americans that has poisoned our politics. And American democracy claims that anyone can become president regardless of background, but the reality is that class matters enormously in how presidents are perceived and how they relate to each other and how they're remembered by history, most importantly. The Kennedy-Truman feud shows how destructive personal animosity can be in politics, how it prevents collaboration and learning and progress because Truman had wisdom and experience that Kennedy desperately needed, while Kennedy had energy and vision that could have inspired Truman to contribute to a new generation of leadership. But instead they spent years insulting each other and refusing to cooperate, wasting their talents on mutual contempt. The 2-year ban on Truman from the Kennedy White House stands as one of the pettiest acts in presidential history because Kennedy had legitimate grievances about Truman's 1960 attacks. Absolutely, but responding by freezing out the only living Democratic ex-president was childish and counterproductive and ultimately self-defeating. Though Truman deserves his share of blame too, because his 1960 attacks on Kennedy were unnecessarily personal, going beyond legitimate policy criticism into personal insult, questioning Kennedy's maturity and calling him a puppet of his father, starting the fight even if Kennedy escalated it. In the end, both men lost from their mutual hatred with Kennedy, losing access to Truman's hard-won wisdom about the presidency. Truman losing the opportunity to influence a new generation of Democratic leadership, the Democratic Party losing the chance for continuity and learning across generations, and American politics losing another opportunity for leaders to rise above personal grievances for the greater good. And that's the real tragedy here. Not that two men didn't like each other, but that their personal dislike prevented them from serving the country as well as they could have. Harry Truman died in 1972, 9 years after Kennedy's assassination, and in his final years he softened somewhat on Kennedy, acknowledging that he had been too harsh in 1960. But Truman never admitted he was wrong about Kennedy being inexperienced, going to his grave believing Kennedy had been promoted to fast and that his presidency had suffered for it. While the Kennedy family never softened on Truman at all, remembering his attacks and his opposition, and when the Kennedy Presidential Library was built, Truman wasn't honored prominently with the Kennedy mythology that developed after JFK's death, largely writing Truman out of Democratic Party history, treating the Kennedy presidency as a fresh start rather than a continuation of Democratic traditions. That's the real legacy of Kennedy banning Truman from the White House, not just 2 years of petty exclusion, but a symbolic break between old and new Democrats, between working class and professional class liberalism, between experience and charisma, with Kennedy announcing that his party didn't need Truman anymore, that the old ways were finished, that a new generation had taken command, and whether that was good or bad depends on your political perspective. But what's absolutely certain is that the personal hatred between these two men prevented productive collaboration that could have benefited both of them and the country they claimed to serve. Harry Truman, who had been President of the United States, who had made decisions that shaped the world, spent 2 years knowing he wasn't welcome in the White House because he had insulted a young senator's qualifications, and John F. Kennedy, who became president despite enormous obstacles, spent 2 years making sure Truman knew he wasn't needed or wanted. And sometimes the most powerful people in the world are just as petty as everyone else, just as driven by pride and wounded ego and the need to get even, and both men proved it through their actions to presidents supposedly dedicated to public service who couldn't get past their mutual contempt long enough to work together for the good of the country. And that's not just a historical curiosity or an interesting footnote, that's a warning about what happens when ego matters more than duty, when personal grievances matter more than public service, when leaders forget that they're supposed to be serving something larger than themselves and their own wounded pride.